right, thank you very much. We're about to start the final sessions to take us through to the close. I'm going to be calling on a presenter that was on our panel yesterday and presented on some really interesting topics with some really good research behind that. And I'll be calling on Yaa Aguiari Dombo to join us on the stage. The topic that she's going to be talking on is with all the green compliance requirements, recycling of vessels is really going to become a real challenge for us in the future. Yaa is a consultant at Frost & Sullivan based in South Africa, and I'm really interested to hear Yaa a little bit more about green recycling of vessels. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. As the chairman did say, my name is Yaa Aguiari Dombo. I'm a consultant from a market research intelligence firm called Frost & Sullivan based in Cape Town. And today I'll be speaking to you on the growing environmental and labor concerns in the global shipbreaking industry and how this presents a desperate need for green compliant ship recycling facilities. Okay. It's not working, the slides. Okay. Okay, I think I'll just tell you when to change. As I go through this presentation, I've kind of broken the presentation down into 4 different segments. So for us to understand why there has been a growing concern with ship recycling, we need to understand where the ship recycling or the shipbreaking industry currently is right now. Then we need to look at the legislation that is governing the shipbreaking industry and how this has impacted shipping companies and how this is driving increasingly sustainable practices in the industry. And then I will present to you on Africa's first green ship recycling facility in the region. Next slide, please. So for us to understand in general the shipbreaking industry to begin with, we need to understand how the industry kind of comes about. So vessels operate for about 20 to 30 years, and once these vessels come to the end of life, they need to be disposed of. And they need to be disposed of responsibly because a vessel has a lot of various different things on it, if I can say, that could be characterized as a hazardous waste. And for this reason, vessels that come to the end of life are characterized as hazardous waste. And so because it's characterized as hazardous waste, there's fuels on there, there's various chemicals such as asbestos, PCBs. All of these need to be discarded of responsibly to ensure that there's no contamination of the ocean or causing any labor impacts to that of those who are discarding of these waste chemicals, if I can say. So currently, the global shipbreaking industry is being controlled or governed, rather dominated by Southeast Asia. And so as you can see in the pie chart over there, a significant amount of our vessels are being broken down in the likes of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. In 2019, 674 commercial vessels were sold for scrapyards globally. 90% of these happened to be decommissioned in Southeast Asia. And the reason for this is because for the ship owners, once the vessel comes to its end of life, they don't necessarily want it to be a liability. You want to obviously be able to send off your vessel, you know, kind of discard it, if I can say, and move on to the next thing. You don't necessarily want to spend a lot of money for it. In Southeast Asia, they offer the highest premium for end-of-life vessels. And the reason for this is because they have a very mature downstream market, which means that they are able to recycle a significant amount of the material that comes off the vessels. And also they have a very strong ability to absorb steel plates, equipment, and various metals that can come from the vessel. And that's where a lot of the price comes from. So there are other shipbreaking regions in the world. There is Turkey, there's China, and then there's Europe. But in terms of end-of-life vessel pricing, Southeast Asia offers the highest. Now, the problem with Southeast Asia is that their shipbreaking practices compared to global standards has been come to question The reason for this is because the vessels are decommissioned or recycled on beaches. So this method is called beaching. So once the vessel comes to its end of life, the beach comes and is pushed on shore, and the laborers come and just, they can start cutting and start taking off whatever is on the vessel. The problem with this is that if it's not done properly, you could have an oil leakage, fuel leakage that goes onto the oceans. The laborers don't wear correct protective gear, which means that, when you're climbing on top of the vessels and you fall, it could be detrimental. You could also, they go with blow torches to dismantle the vessels. If you don't know where the certain fuel holding cells are, you can cause an explosion. And so because of this growing concern, there has been more international legislation that has kind of driven the industry to put in more stringent practices. So the next slide. So over here, I have the 3 legislative bodies that are controlling the industry. So the first one is the Hong Kong Convention. So the Hong Kong Convention's aim is to ensure that ship recycling does not cause any risks to human health or the environment. Unfortunately, it's not yet ratified, and they are hoping to make sure it's ratified by 2025. For the Hong Kong Convention to be ratified, one of the top 3 countries, like I mentioned in the previous slide, India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, they need to ratify it, which means that they need to transform their shipbreaking practices to comply with the Hong Kong Convention. So the Hong Kong Convention states along the lines of, you need to ensure that your laborers are protected, as well as that when you decommission these vessels, the chemicals are properly discarded of. You have correct debunkering practices, that you're able to efficiently remove the fuel from the vessels without contaminating the nearby ocean. Then we have the EU ship recycling regulation, which is very similar to the Hong Kong Convention. However, they have additional regulations that is specifically towards EU member states. And in a couple of slides, I'll then show you that a lot of the ships that we see on the waters are owned by EU countries. And in an attempt to protect the industry, a lot of regulators have kind of now put the blame back onto the ship owners and saying that, it's your responsibility once your vessel comes to life. You need to be able to find a good ship recycling destination for the vessels, because a lot of the times once the vessel comes to the end of life, the ship owners sell the vessel and then they're like, it's not my problem, and it gets sent off to wherever it does. And so it's been difficult to kind of like put the blame in terms of upholding who's responsible for what. And so now regulators have kind of shifted it to ship owners to say, if your vessels aren't recycled in a responsible way, there will be certain consequences that come through. Then the third one is the Basel Ban Convention, which has been here for a couple of years. And it basically looks at ensuring that developed countries do not send hazardous waste to developing countries. And like I mentioned earlier, once a vessel comes to its end of life, it's characterized as hazardous waste. And so this is kind of to curb, the sending of European countries or China, etc., their vessels to that of developing nations like in Southeast Asia. So as we can see, there's been more stringent regulation that is pushing the industry to enforce these practices. But in addition to that, we have shipping companies, where shipping companies have now decided to, like I mentioned, take the responsibility on themselves, and they are now enforcing their own policies. And this has been driven by stakeholder pressure, the financial investors, as well as just how the industry is going. So shipping companies now have their own internal stringent policies, where we have different organizations that shipping companies sign up to meet certain criteria. And what this does is that this opens opportunities for compliant ship recycling facilities. So if we go to the next slide, like I mentioned, there's a lot of the vessels are owned by Greece, China, and USA, and they're the top owning countries. But the problem with ship recycling is kind of twofold. So we have a lot of vessels that need to be responsibly decommissioned, and a lot of shipping companies, like I mentioned, they are saying, let's put in our own regulation to make sure that the vessels are responsible properly. However, the reason that Asia another attractive area is because when the vessels are decommissioned in the beaching method, you don't have a limit on the vessel size. So Europe has a significant amount of ship recycling facilities, and these facilities are environmentally compliant. They make sure that the labor practices are safe. However, there's a limit to the vessel size, and of course, the price that ship owners get from the vessel is lower because Europe has higher labor costs, et cetera, and they use, very technologically advanced equipment, which is more expensive, which all factors into the cost of the vessel purchasing price. So globally, in addition to finding a compliant ship recycling facility, there's also a need for a ship recycling facility that can accommodate these very large vessels. Turkey comes in close. So Turkey is kind of like the middle spot between that of Southeast Asia and Europe, because Turkey can offer a competitive price compared to that of Southeast Asia, and Turkey has made active efforts over the years to transform their shipbreaking industry to comply with a lot of the regulation. And this then presents or brings me to my case study, which is the 34 South facility. So the 34 South facility is a partnership between the IDC, and it is Africa's first and only green ship recycling facility. So as Frost & Sullivan, we worked on this project for over a year, looking at the feasibility of establishing a ship recycling facility in Africa. And we saw that there are opportunities, like I mentioned. The industry is becoming more greener, and because even though the Hong Kong Convention is not yet ratified, a lot of shipping companies are promoting their own internal legislation that is pushing for them to send their vessels to very specific ship recycling facilities. But then the problem comes in is a lot of these shipping companies have these massive ships, and they don't know where to send them to. And if we look also on the west coast of Africa, we have a lot of vessels that are operating in the oil industry. This could be the likes of oil rigs, the tugboats, a lot of vessels that are associated with oil, and in a lot of the times, these are massive vessels. And once the vessel comes to its end of life, an additional cost that ship owners look to is the final voyage cost. And so if you are operating in West African waters, it makes more financial sense to send your vessel for decommissioning to that of South Africa instead of sending it to the likes of Turkey or Southeast Asia, because those are the regions that can accommodate for deep water ships. Secondly, what we also found is that a lot of ship owners in the past have opted to reroute their vessels bypassing the Cape of Good Hope instead of going through the Suez Canal. Of course, it does add a couple of days, but because of the high tolls of the Suez Canal, some companies have been more and more promoting to go around the Cape of Good Hope, which then means that the final voyage cost for a vessel that bypasses the Cape of Good Hope can now be incorporated into once the vessel comes to its end of life, which brings more opportunities for this facility in South Africa. So as indicated over here, this 34 South facility is going to be located in Saldanha. And it presents a significant amount of opportunity for the region, as it'll boost trade, strengthen South Africa's scrap metal industry, and of course create a significant amount of jobs in that industry, whether it be a skilled or non-skilled. There's a lot of job opportunity that can come through this. This ship recycling facility aims to ensure that these vessels are recycled economically, and while making sure that it's environmentally compliant. So in general, South Africa has very stringent regulation in terms of our waters and what we can put in our waters, etc. So a lot of ships already have to make sure that they're in line with this in terms of polluting our waters. So we are already on par with the legislation that has already been set in terms of protecting South Africa's waters. This ship recycling facility is looking to decommission these vessels on a ship lift. So I've indicated over there, and this image was sourced directly from 34 South. So they are looking to decommission the vessels on a ship lift, which means that the vessels come on their own steam, and then there's machinery that lifts the vessel up and puts it on land where it can be decommissioned responsibly. And in this way, you also limit the amount of pollution that goes back into the ocean. So like I said, this facility is also going to be able to accommodate for large vessels. So it can accommodate for vessels of 240 meters long and 40 meters wide with an 18,000 LDT capacity, so lightweight tonnage. And currently the project is in the developmental and design phase. And if you want to learn more about the 34 South facility, I have added the company link at the bottom. So in conclusion, there is a global need and requirement for compliant ship recycling facilities. The reasons for this is because we need to adhere to legislation, we need to protect our own oceans, we need to protect the environment. But in addition to environment, we also need to protect the laborers that are, decommissioning these vessels, because a lot of people unfortunately have gotten hurt. We need to accommodate for shipping companies' internal policies as we wait for additional legislation to come into ratification. And we also need to ensure that we can responsibly decommission these very large vessels that a lot of the time are being sent out of Southeast Asia. So like I said, the 34 South facility will have capacity to be able to accommodate for these vessels, and it also is a prime location because of the vessels that are being rerouted, as well as the fact that we have a lot of opportunities just in Africa's waters with a lot of vessels that are operating in our waters. A lot of the times don't necessarily have a place to go for responsible ship recycling facilities. Thank you. And yeah, are there any questions?
It's an exciting project that you mentioned there, and I've just been onto the website to have a look quickly. So it really looks great. If you have any questions, please, while Ya is with us, if you would like to ask her, or if there's something you would like to pick up with her on an individual basis afterwards. Thank you very much, Ya. That was fantastic. Thank you for taking the time and giving us an insight into some of those challenges and the positioning that the project has now got in Cape Town. I'd like to now turn to one of our online presenters, and I'll give a short introduction. Is Peter with us? Peter's going to be dialing in from the UK as well. So we'll just wait a minute and see that he's connected. Right, Peter, there you go. Good to see you. I'm just going to give a short introduction, and then I'll hand over to you, and you can pick up the topic. So Peter Ello is a policy director based in the UK at the United Kingdom Chamber of Shipping, has a previous experience in the shipping industry and various aspects of the maritime sector, as I understand, from the fishing industry as well as oil and gas, if I understand that's correct. At the moment, we're really looking forward to hearing a bit more about the logistics chains and how we can build and make them much more robust. So, Peter, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, it's fantastic to be here, and really looking forward to chatting with you for 20 minutes about greener regulations for transport networks of the future. Thank you for that introduction. I've been at the Chamber for just over a year now, and the sole focus of our activity on the policy department at the UK Chamber of Shipping has been in regard to decarbonisation, whether that be at the International Maritime Organisation, whether that be regionally with EU, even though we have technically left the European Union, or at the national level as well. So it is very much at the forefront of our activities at the moment, and looking to see how we can align everything with the Paris Treaty. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about that, but just to start off with, I'm just going to give you a wee bit of background as to what the UK Chamber of Shipping is. So we're a collection of ship owners in a trade association, about 80 ship owners, very diverse, and then another 120 organisations, businesses and practices that have shipping interests. We were the forerunner of the International Chamber of Shipping, and we are members of the International Chamber of Shipping as well as the European communities of ship owning associations. We have a club membership at BIMCO, and so we're very well connected throughout the shipping arena. And we've probably got one of the larger policy teams of worldwide shipping associations. We've taken a number of initiatives in the recent years to look at how we can spread our connections and network. Now we've set up something called the M7, which mirrors the G7 Plus conference, where the shipping associations come together and look at various issues, some of which have been electronic bills of lading. But what I want to talk about today is transport networks and what shipping is going to do in that regard. There is a little bit of a delay between me and you in South Africa because I'm in England, but I'm hoping that this is going to work. I'm just waiting for that screen to move. I wonder if someone could just move the slides on one, because it seems to be thank you very much. So the basis of this, decarbonisation for shipping, is to look at where shipping fits into the pattern of transport activities and energy activities in the world. Shipping wasn't included in the Paris Treaty. It was deemed too difficult to align. But in actual fact, measurement of shipping carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions have been taking place since about 2008. So consequently, we're very aware of where our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is, but we're also very aware of what we do. And I think it's important to reflect, albeit these are percentages, that for 10% of emissions worldwide, we're moving 80% of international goods. So we're the most efficient transport sector. We are a force for good. We bring food, medical supplies, raw materials, and energy supplies to countries that otherwise wouldn't have them, to continents that otherwise wouldn't have them. And so from that perspective, in terms of world demographics, in terms of the world population, and in terms of the health of the world, the shipping is a force for good there. So it's very clear to us in the shipping industry that we need to change and improve our greenhouse gas emissions, but we need to continue to move goods around the world for those purposes. Next slide, please. So one of the other aspects of what shipping has done, there's been a reduction in the world trade since 2020. But in actual fact, if you look at the overall picture and the blue line there and the red line there, you can see that from the International Energy Agency, this is reference, you can see that the emission levels have mirrored that effect. And so whilst there has been a reduction in trade, there's also been a reduction in GHG emissions. And the reason that slide's there is just to highlight that very obviously there is a move towards reducing trade, transport of trade, because that localisation is seen as a way forward. But I don't think that's the case. I think shipping can move very quickly to decarbonise, very quickly indeed once we have seen a scaling up of new technologies. But there's going to be a lot to do to achieve it. And that's really what this presentation is about. Next slide, please. So what are the options? Well, whatever option we choose, other than nuclear energy, which is a very difficult energy source to manage from a security and safety perspective, whatever fuel we choose, it's very clear that that fuel has less energy in it per tonne than fossil fuel. So whilst we want to move very quickly to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we also recognise that shipping itself is going to change. It is going to require more bunkering facilities. It is possibly going to require to change the design of ships so that either they can carry more fuel per cargo tonne, or they are going to change their trading routes, in which case there may be a different size. So the fuels of choice at the moment the transition, so that means they emit less carbon dioxide. LNG has a challenge with methane slip, but overall it generates a 20% reduction in carbon dioxide. And biofuels, which are effectively a net zero carbon dioxide fuel. And methanol is coming online too. These options, I mean LNG particularly and methanol, these options might well be carbon free in the sense that they can be offset because you can generate synthetic LNG and you can also make green methanol. The problem being that you would need a lot of extra equipment on board the vessel to remove some residual carbon dioxide and carbon output. But the carbon zero fuels of the future the shipping industry sees outside batteries and electrification, which is going to prove very challenging, not just in terms of raw materials, but also in terms of capacity and charging. The most likely fuels at the moment that we see are hydrogen and ammonia. Both of those difficult fuels in terms of storage and handling. One's top, the other one has in terms of explosive. And I think it is very fair to reflect that fossil fuels actually have delivered a huge amount of positivity in handling storage. Whilst, you know, if an oil spill is a terrible scenario, the reality is a tank of fuel is not particularly combustible, it's not particularly explosive, and consequently it's the engines where the danger is, but the tanks itself are not such a great danger. We have a difference here, one in the storage, hydrogen, particularly if you're storing it at cryogenic levels. The other one, ammonia, which is hugely toxic in terms of handling, very dangerous. So we are moving into a different phase as far as fuels are concerned when we go there. And that's going to be incredibly important in terms of infrastructure as well as onboard activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is our agenda? What is shipping thinking about at the moment? Well, the first one is obviously to generate encouragement and enthusiasm for investing in new technologies. And if I talk about technology levels at the moment, they're still quite new. They haven't been scaled up. We have got hydrogen ships working in Japan. We've just seen the launch of a small container vessel in Norway that's battery powered. And we expect to see ammonia ships being delivered in about 2 years' time. So these are starting, but they're prototypes. They're not being scaled up. The supporting bunkering facilities are not really established, and it's very early days. And the world is getting used to introducing new technology and scaling it up very quickly. But these are of a scale that is very, very large, inordinately large, probably outside everything other than power generation. And so the impact and the requirements to scale them up are vast. So we have worked very closely with the UK government and also the International Chamber of Shipping, which is a non-government organisation, the International Maritime Organisation, and looking for international agreements on measures which will combat climate change. And these are short, medium and long term. The short ones are relatively straightforward. The medium term, yet to be decided, debate started, still ongoing. The longer term ones are ones that we're thinking about, but whether they come to fruition in the short term, in the short to medium frame is unlikely. The other area is the industry itself, outside governments, is generating industry protocols on things like finance and chartering, more of which later. Next slide, please. So the current strategy is, as I said, these concepts haven't been delivered to scale. But what we have started to do is to generate regulatory measures to make existing ships and current new builds more efficient. And what we're doing there is the IMO is almost at the point of agreeing on indices or measurements, if you like, of vessel designs and also the design of existing vessels and how those vessels can be managed in a more efficient manner. That might be slower steaming. When the first issue regarding climate change was discussed at IMO in 2008, many of the ships started steaming slower. And so consequently, while we're moving 50% more goods than we were in 2008, we're actually emitting less than 5% more carbon dioxide. And the reason for that is slower steaming. Slow steaming is one lever one can use to reduce the carbon dioxide output, but there are others. We're seeing a lot of investment now in air technology to make ships move through the water move smoothly. And all these incremental features, whether it be that, whether it be propeller design, whether it be ship design, whether it be wind sails, you saw in my first slide a picture of a ship carrying sails, etc. All these things make incremental improvements to the carbon dioxide emissions. And that's where we are at the moment. We're trying to improve what we currently have to reduce carbon dioxide. New builds that are coming out at the moment are dual fuel, they're hybrid vessels. Some of them are LNG orientated. Maersk will be delivering methanol ships in the near future. All of these are improving the, or reducing, should I say, the greenhouse gas emissions in the near future. We then look at what we call market-based measures. Now, these are designed really or considered to accelerate this process. So we have prototypes. We work out from the prototypes and the use of the prototypes which designs we think are going to go forward. And then we need to make financial measures or introduce financial measures to make sure that this happens as quickly as possible. And some of those are levies. So one of the concepts is hydrogen and ammonia are far more expensive as fuels at the moment. So the one way of ensuring that people have a lever, if you like, to make that decision as an investor is to make the cost of fossil fuel the same as hydrogen and ammonia. So that would be a levy on the fossil fuels. As an industry, we'd obviously like to see that money collected from the levy returning to the industry for research and development, and for scaling up and for infrastructure. But we're not quite sure if that's going to run forward. It will depend how it's organised. But clearly making the playing field level so that there is no financial advantage to using fossil fuels is one lever to use. The other one is emissions trading, where we're looking at issuing allowances for emissions that can be traded. That's already the case in power generation in many areas of the world. And I think it will be coming into shipping in the EU regional area relatively shortly. And then from there on, what we'll see will be that two sorts of systems. One system is called a cap and trade, and that basically restricts how much emissions licenses, if you like, that you can have. And if you don't use them, you can trade them. If you don't have enough of them to do the activities you're doing, you can buy more. The other one is a baseline system where each ship is given on an IMO number an allowance, and that over a period of time is reduced, but it stays with the ship. So there are various ways of that happening, but it's quite clear that emissions trading and levies or taxes are going to be needed to accelerate this process to encourage people to move away from fossil fuels and an established area for over 100 years towards new fuel technology. I think the critical issue that hasn't been thought about much in detail, because it's almost government-led, is infrastructure. So if you look at the trading routes around the world today, we move fuels by tankers where there aren't fuels available. Where there are fuels available, trading routes for bunkers, trading routes are established and they run pretty much like clockwork. In the new area, there'll be more than one type of fuel. The source of green fuels, whether it be ammonia or hydrogen, will have to be done by renewables. So renewable-rich countries will be looking at generating these fuels. Those fuels will then need to be transported to established bunkering routes. So consequently, the infrastructure investment is going to be significant. And if you're a vessel owner, you probably aren't going to buy a new fuel technology vessel unless you know where the infrastructure is, because clearly you've got to better operate it. And consequently, I think this is an important decision, and most nations need to be thinking about it. And then finally, the shipbuilding and recycling area. We currently have a capacity in the world, if you take all the shipyards above 5,000 ton vessels, we're looking at about 3% of the current fleet. So on that basis, running at 3%, we can probably just about, if we started now, renew the fleet by 2050. So if the target is net zero for 2050, we need to start building new fuel vessels now. And the prototypes are there, but they're small, they're not scaled up. So we're going to need more shipbuilding capacity, that's very clear. We also need to think about recycling and disposals. And what do we do with the old vessels? Quite clearly now, new vessels on order, one of the considerations is can it be retrofitted for a new fuel type in due course? And those designs are in place, and that's happening with new builds that are being ordered now. And we will obviously see more of that. But at some stage, it's got to flip. and then so that there isn't a disposal required. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what has been decided thus far on that strategy? Well, we've adopted something called the fourth greenhouse gas study, which is looking at the inventories of current emissions to see what levels they are in nitrogen, sulfur, and more importantly, carbon dioxide. We have agreed in principle the regulatory measures I mentioned earlier in terms of the EEDI, which is the energy efficiency design indices, EEXI, which is energy efficient existing index, and the CI, which is the carbon intensity indicator. Those three you will hear more about. Fundamentally, they're about the design of the vessel, and they're also about the emission of carbon from the vessel. And both of those will be restricted more and more as time goes by to encourage vessels to operate more efficiently and to encourage people to move away from fossil fuel type vessels to new fueled vessels. There is some support at the IMO for a research fund. That's based on taking $1 per tonne of fuel as a levy against anyone operating ships above 5,000 tonnes, and putting that money into a pool to enable all countries, whether they be less developed or developed countries, to generate better designs and to scale up the hydrogen and ammonia vessels of the future. And then finally, whilst I talked about emissions trading and I've talked about levies, those aren't in place yet. So those discussions have started, and the original IMO plan was that those discussions would be complete by 2023. So in actual fact, in the original 2018 established IMO plan, we are broadly speaking on time. Unfortunately, of course, the political will is to go faster. And it's quite clear that the Paris Treaty goals are being reviewed on a regular basis, as they are in shipping, and we will need to go faster. So that's very clear. So the IMO needs to move at a faster pace. 174 member states makes it quite challenging. A number of issues on UN principles and how money is divested means that when we're talking about very large funds of money from levies, it's quite challenging. We're talking about international trading schemes. If they're collected by international funds, again, that is quite challenging. So whether we can go faster than the original IMO plan, I personally would be surprised. But it's something we need to be trying to do as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So what else is the industry doing? So that's the IMO. The IMO is a collection of member states, which are the national governments, in which South Africa is a member of. But the industry itself, has it got initiatives? And the two main ones that we've seen thus far in terms of greening up shipping. One is the Poseidon Principles. Now, this is where a group of financial organisations and institutes have got together and said, we will only finance ships of a certain type. And they're looking at criteria against those vessels for which they will invest. The other one is the charterers. So those that charter vessels, whether that be bulk carriers and the very large mining companies and commodity houses of the world are very much signed up to this, is to align is the right word with the Poseidon Principles, but basically to say, take the criteria from the Poseidon Principles, apply it to this the same way to those vessels, but to deem whether or not they would charter the vessel on that basis. So you've got one based on finance and one based on chartering. And so they're very much self-generated industry initiatives looking at how we can accelerate this process of moving from fossil fuels to green fuels in the future. Next slide, please. So the next 10 years, it's been called in the shipping industry the brutal decay, because we need to make this change and it's going to hurt because the costs are going to go up. Now, those costs will be passed on to the consumer ultimately, and because shipping is very efficient, most consumers will not notice a particular change in costs in the same way. But the current targets need to be addressed. The IMO target, as it stands, is a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Many countries, and including the United Kingdom, the United States, and indeed all members of the UK Chamber of Shipping have declared a net zero target by 2050, which aligns with the 1.5 degrees centigrade increase agreed at the Paris Treaty. Research and development funding from governments is coming. It's trickling out at the moment. It needs to come at a higher level because we've got to regenerate what we are doing. and we have from the UK government about £300 million that has been committed over a period of years to look at research and development and funds. We have a clean maritime demonstration competition in the United Kingdom, of which there were 200 organisations competed and have won funding from the government, which is match funded. So the companies are putting a little bit of money and the government are putting a significant amount of money in to generate prototypes for clean energy shipping, whether that be shore power in harbours, whether that be prototypes of ships or prototypes of equipment, or even vessel designs and feasibility studies. So we are moving in the United Kingdom in that direction, and obviously a lot of read across from the aviation industry and the automotive industry that have been there slightly ahead of the curve because their challenges are greater. There's little evidence that delays in new fuel technologies will affect international targets because we are there now in the sense that engine manufacturers can deliver engines that can use ammonia and hydrogen today. What we haven't got yet is a scaled up ship type design that's proven to encourage investors to invest upon. Next slide, please. So that's my presentation. The only thing I was going to add to that is that the political will, as people will be aware, is ramping up quite quickly. Shipping has not been seen at the forefront of government activity, but it's becoming more and more so now. There is something that we've announced in the UK called the Clydebank Declaration, which looks at green routes in shipping. So basically it's there to encourage organisations that are moving shipping or ships from a port in the UK to a port in another country on a direct trading route. And it's called the Clydebank Declaration. It came out of COP26 in Glasgow, and it looks to encourage those green routes as an exemplar of future trade routes for shipping. That concludes my presentation. Delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter, for unpacking quite a complicated topic and quite a challenging one for the maritime industry. Would there be any questions from the floor? If we do have any questions for Peter? Certainly, Peter, your presentation will be available on the event platform, and I'm sure there will be people reaching out to you, particularly from the maritime sector. I was really interested in this topic because we have quite a big maritime client base ourselves, and so they are wrestling with this challenge of when and how to transform their fleets, and as you said, availability of the new fuels as well as the availability of the vessels is the real sort of conundrum, and the funding that goes around that and some of those infrastructure challenges at the port level are really important considerations. So thank you for touching on those, and we do appreciate your time, and thank you for joining us from the UK.
Thanks very much.
I'm going to let you go. Thank you. I'm going to call on Mervyn Chetty to join me on the podium. And I think that's going to be our last session. So as Mervyn comes up, he will introduce his panel and take us into the last period. I'll introduce Mervyn when he's settled on. I've known Mervyn Chetty for many years, and going back over his short bio, realizing that he's spent a great deal of that time at the Transnet organization, and been involved in strategy-related issues related to the port, but also to the rail and also the industries and pipeline industries surrounding this really important aspect of our logistics. He's obviously been actively involved in the strategy development, freight logistics. He's been looking at the operational turnaround of the organization. He's been integrally involved in working with, as Chief Strategy Officer, in securing different aspects of the business, and he's been particularly in the last few years challenged with opportunities engaging with ports and operations in the rest of Africa. He studied logistics and freight transport in Germany and has developed a very good understanding of the industry and the sector. And I'd like to hand over to Mervyn for him to introduce the rest of his panel.
Thanks, Jeff. I know it's a graveyard session. Normally that's what it's called. But unfortunately in Durban, we call this the beach session. Because I know I'm standing between the Women's Awards dinner tonight and also your visit to the beach. So I'll try and make up some time. I know we've lost quite a bit of time. We have 3 people, 1 online. So if you don't mind, the panelists, can you come up, Lovemore and Dr. Lufuno? Ed, I think, is online. If the guys from the tech can just confirm that Ed is great stuff. All right, so whilst Lufuno and Lovemore are making their way on stage, I thought I'll buy some time and perhaps just ask them to sort of briefly introduce themselves. So we'll do it a bit differently this time. So I know Lovemore has been introduced many times already, but let's start off with Lufuno.
Thanks, Mervyn. My name is Lufuno Ralpata. I'm currently General Manager, Transnet Port Terminals. It's one of the Transnet operating division responsible for terminal operations across the 8 ports. We've got 16 terminals. Thank you.
Lovemore.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Lovemore Bingandadi. I'm currently program manager for a project on trade and transport facilitation. It's a project of SADC, COMESA, and the East African Community with 25 beneficiary member states. The objective is to harmonize cross-border road transport laws, regulations, systems, and standards across Africa. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think Ed's online.
Good afternoon, all. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Ed Stumpf, Investment Director at African Infrastructure Investment Managers. For those that don't know AIM, we are a private equity investor specializing in infrastructure investment in the region. We're a subsidiary of the Old Mutual Investment Group, and we have a current portfolio of around $2 billion of assets spread across 19 different countries in Africa. A large number of those assets are transportation and logistics assets. We have equity interests in the road concessions to Maputo, to Durban, being the N3, and the Bakwena concession towards Botswana, as well as interests in a number of port terminal assets in the region, in Tanzania and in Zambia. And we've recently announced our intention to acquire the logistics group in South Africa, which has various port terminal assets and a presence in 6 different logistics corridors in the region.
Thanks, thanks, Ed. So just to put things in context, this panel discussion is around building efficient and robust logistics chains. And I thought it would be apt to put it in context, just to share 2 slides, 2 punchy slides, if the guys can just flash it up. I think over the last 2 days, we've seen different versions of various different corridor maps for Africa. And I think more importantly, these corridors do exist in various different forms, whether it's in the AU Declaration or Agenda 2063, in various different literatures, it's all in there. Essentially, when you look at the various different corridors that we have on the continent, there's certainly a strong interdependence between maritime infrastructure and inland freight corridors. But we'll get to some of the challenges on just now to talk about how we as a continent tend to spend a lot of investment around the maritime sector, but we ignore the inland infrastructure. And certainly those are arteries and veins of any logistics system. If that system gets cholesterol, then certainly you're going to have blockages in the system, similar to what we're seeing in some of the cross-border posts right now. We know Africa has certainly a high transport costs, but when you look at the 12 strategic freight corridors, and there could be more, I think the ability for us to actually invest in some of these corridors to make it efficient is a significant challenge. Africa needs about $90 billion worth of investments to go in every year for the next 10 years in ports, rail, pipelines, roads, and telecommunications. And those are significant numbers, and I don't think so we even 25% are going in there. What is also crucial around this is that back in the day, infrastructure, a lot of companies, governments focused on infrastructure, which is great, but I think that is now under the bridge. It's water underneath the bridge. Now the new buzzword is infrastructure. We should be focusing on infrastructure, digitizing that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. If we can go on to the next slide and the last one, I thought this was something that I wanted to zoom into, just to illustrate to you that several of the international terminal operators are securing port assets, not only in East Africa, West Africa, North Africa. So, so that's one part. So the ITOs are definitely investing in ports. But shipping lines, and I think there are some here as well, now they are seeking to develop inland terminals and inland corridors because for easier transport of goods from origin to destination. And when you look at the various different corridors in there, like in Kenya, you have the Lapsset corridor from Lamu to Isiolo, and it covers 3 countries going into Ethiopia and South Sudan. That Lapsset corridor is an important one as it services more than one country. And it is supported by the 3 countries. And I think these are some of the corridors that do exist, but they exist in paper. And I think the challenge for us as Africa is now how do we make these things work. I think the 3 important corridors in East Africa that the global market is focusing is it's the Lapsset corridor, the North-South corridor. The North-South corridor is the one from DRC, Zambia, Botswana coming down to South Africa. You would have heard earlier on today my colleague talking about the work that we've done through the North-South corridor. I'll give you a good example. 300,000 tons of copper comes from Lubumbashi down into Durban. That's what it used to happen, but that's not taking place right now. Now we find that the same copper is going through Walvis Bay, going to Dar es Salaam. Reason for that is because of inefficient supply chains. So Tazara corridor is the other one, and certainly the Central corridor in Tanzania. So I think in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, a lot of the markets focused around maritime infrastructure, but we actually didn't put a lot of effort into looking at inland infrastructure, and that's why you find there's a WhatsApp video going around on various different trucks waiting at the Maputo border, coal going down into Maputo, and I think the one-stop border posts are certainly not working, and I was disappointed yesterday and today that we didn't deal with that decisively. We've had key people in here, but we skirted around the issue. And quite frankly, I think we should have dealt with that very decisively, because at the end of the day, the cost of high transport cost is a result of what's happening down on the ground. So that's setting the context. I thought we'll just spend a few minutes around that, and then I'm going to ask our panel members to sort of give 2 minutes insights into what their views are around efficient and robust logistics chains.
Thanks, Maiben. I'm not sure if the guys at the back can flight my slide, but basically I'm looking at the role of technology in terms of creating and building an efficient and robust logistic system. In particular, we are competing globally. and we are part of these trade routes. And efficiency becomes the very critical in terms of the speed and the agility. So if you can see at the slide that I've put there, you have got a vessel that is coming in with expectation in terms of global benchmarks, in terms of what is required, in terms of the loading and the unloading at a seaport. So we have to attend to the issue of efficiency, productivity, and accessibility. And technology then becomes a strategic capability and a differentiator, in the sense that you need to ensure that in terms even of your navigation, the AIS stands for Automation Identification System that is run by IMO. That system assists in the maritime world in terms of the navigation, and you need to be connected to that system so that there's seamless navigation in terms of vessel traffic in and traffic out. So the role of technology is becoming a differentiator, and then if you are not efficient enough, then you'll be find yourself out of those trade routes where they will opt for other port or other corridor that is more efficient and productive. So at the same time, as Marvin has indicated, the issue of the inland terminals then becomes also a critical issue in terms of feeding, in terms of the export, but also in terms of going into the greater part of the continent. Then we also have the cross-border issue, which is where the trade corridor then comes in. Now, we've been talking for, I think, a decade or so about the national single window. And I think there are some other countries in the continent that have made progress. But if you look at particularly in the SADC region, I think we are a little bit behind. You might find that we might have a little bit better national single view. But when it comes to cross-border, what Ivan was talking about, the issue of those trucks, it just comes back down again in terms of the technology that we are using, in terms of the visibility. That at the border, they should have anticipated how many trucks are coming. And then at the port, they should also have the system that is looking in terms of the visibility and the issue of access. Now, when it comes to the terminal operating system, that then becomes very critical. For our case, we've got what we call GCOS, which is the General Cargo Operating System, which we use for the auto. We use it for bulk and break bulk. But for container terminal in our space, we're using the Navis. That becomes critical in the planning as well as the execution. You have seen in terms of the World Bank Container Index, some of the terminals, in particular our container terminals in South Africa, are not performing well. And part of that is that we need to ensure that we improve the use of technology there, and also use the use of technology, because what we're also competing is that in some terminals, they've also automated some of their equipment, both in the infrastructure and the superstructure. And we find that we are still not that automated or up to speed. And in some of the instances, you are planning and the other stuff, you are still doing manual. So that's why we say, from where we're sitting, the technology then is becoming a competitive advantage that then differentiates us from others. But in terms of the international, if we want better performance of the corridor, we need to then talk of what we call international single window, where the national single windows interact with each other. And we know as we sit here that in the border in Messina, the trucks that are going out and coming in, and be expected at City Deep in Johannesburg, and be expected in Durban, so that the terminal is ready to feed into those. So those are some of the things that we're looking at. And of course, in terms of digital technologies, there are a lot of opportunities there. We talk of a robotic-based automation. That's more of automating your equipment. But again, then the challenge that we're faced with is also issues of the ICT infrastructure and the network that we need to attend to. Earlier, some colleagues in some session, they were talking about the funding. And I think that's the area and the space that we need to focus on in terms of some of the funding of ICT infrastructure. And also you look at the trade agreements. We have talked about the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement or National Single View. We need to act on those across the region. the regulatory frameworks that are there. We're talking about cyber attacks and the likes. How then do we protect the systems that we're using, the technology that we're using? So in a nutshell, technology, if we want enhanced performance in our both the sea as well as the inland terminals, but more particularly across the border, technology is not something that we need to think about. It's a must. It's an issue that we need to act on. Of course, if you look at our continent, in particular South Africa, today they announced the unemployment sitting at 35. People then become wary to say, how are you talking about technology and adopting this, whereas we've got so many unemployment? It's an issue of reskilling and an issue of how do you apply it simultaneously in a phased approach, ensuring that you both attend to social challenges, but at the same time, you are both catching up with the global economy, because you are part of that global economy and you cannot be, continue to lag behind. Otherwise, you will be out of the trade routes. I think I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Lufuno. Lovemore, insights?
Thank you. I also have a few slides to share and contextualize this afternoon's discussion. There's a linkage between the fireside chat that we had yesterday and today's. Yesterday I spoke about the 4 ingredients that we need for enhancing cross-border trade and transport facilitation. I spoke about institutions. I spoke about instruments that needs to be signed between member states. I spoke about infrastructure, which we continue to discuss today. But for this afternoon, I'm going to focus more on the ICT application to enhance trade corridor efficiency. This is the subject of smart corridors. Next slide. My presentation is more on explaining what has actually been done by SADC, COMESA, and EAC and the member states in designing and developing smart corridor solutions, principally on the road transport sector. But following on the debate that took place earlier, some of these applications are quite capable of being applied across transport modes, where we talk about integrated road and rail transportation and interface between road, rail, and ports, just as my colleague has just been talking about. Next slide. We derive our mandate as SADC and COMESA and EAC from the African Union Agenda 2063. Yesterday we spoke about Aspiration 2, and there are 2 goals there that talk to improving connectivity. Next slide. So in terms of infrastructure, I'm sharing side by side the map of the Trans-African highways and a detailed map of the SADC transport corridors, because we have got 6 landlocked member states. We have got a high ratio of landlocked to coastal countries, and the landlocked countries require access to regional and global markets. So in SADC, we speak about 18 regional corridors, but the main ones are those that Mr. Chetty was talking about: the North-South corridor, the Walvis Bay, Ndola, Lubumbashi corridor, which is now competing quite strongly, and I'll come to that with the North-South corridor. And we also have the Dar es Salaam and Maputo corridors. The SADC corridors are defined as networks of road and rail transportation anchored on a selected port. So we have got Durban, Walvis Bay, Maputo, Beira, Dar es Salaam, and Luanda as the anchor ports. You will see that the Trans-African highways can be superimposed on the SADC regional transport corridors, so that integrates the development of Southern Africa with the rest of the African continent. So in terms of infrastructure, when I was speaking yesterday about standards, we have agreed in the road transport sector on geometric design standards for the construction and maintenance of those principal road networks. But more importantly, we have also agreed on vehicle load management standards and extra load limits that ought to be acceptable in order to protect the road infrastructure investment. Next slide. Now, you may have your road, you may have your rail and port superstructure, but to make it work more efficiently, you need processes, you need standards, and you need systems. This is where smart corridors come in. The graphic that I'm sharing shows that one of our principal bottlenecks in cross-border road transport, there are two places at the ports because of the poor road-rail interface and other reasons of internal port dynamics, but also at the border posts. That's where we register the greatest delay. As Chetty was saying, we always see dramatic videos of 20-kilometer queues of trucks at Bayet Bridge at Kasumbaleza. The principal reasons are those demands and requirements for port health, for customs, for transport regulations, the payment of road user charges, and law enforcement. All of those requirements and regulatory needs are enforced at the borders. This requires submission of multiplicity of documents relating to the driver, relating to the vehicle, and relating to the load. And all of these are submitted repeatedly. In a standard border crossing, you have got processes on one side of the border which are duplicated on the other side, and they are not simplified, they are not harmonized, and in a number of cases, they are still manual processes. So under smart corridors, what we have done is we have redesigned and re-engineered the business processes that are required. We have simplified and we have digitized those processes so that now, as indicated, a driver, before he departs from Joburg to Lusaka, he can upload and lodge those documents so that the regulatory officials at the intervening border posts can interrogate and authenticate the completeness and validity of those documents prior to the vehicle arriving at the border. Next slide. So WTO, SADC, and other institutions are implementing those various measures. Next slide. Specific to our region, next slide, we have developed what we are referring to as the corridor trip monitoring system. It is a regional system that builds on national transport information system where there are databases of drivers and operators that are then shared across and between member states. Next slide. The corridor trip monitoring system is applied through the databases of national member states. We use the vehicle tracking technology that may already exist in a vehicle. If there's no such technology, the simple cell phone that the driver carries is used to track and monitor the movement of the driver. So once the driver has registered himself on the system, he then receives a QR code on his mobile phone, or he can print a hard copy, and that is what is then used to interrogate, to access data and information by authorized law officials. Next slide. So the corridor trip monitoring system is adding value to the regulatory and law enforcement processes in the SADC member states. We are currently at a pilot phase, next slide, where four members in SADC are installing the system at those borders that are displayed there. Next slide. The pilot is going to complete at the end of December. Thereafter, we will spread the installation of the corridor trip monitoring system to the rest of the region. Next slide. There was an earlier question about the impacts of trade and transport facilitation on our economies. There is a study that was done, commissioned by DBSA, next slide, which captures the employment, the economic and the social benefits. You will be able to read the details at your own time, but the potential for uplifting the economies of the 8 SADC member states that are part of the North-South Corridor is tremendous. And that answers part of the last question that was raised yesterday about what exactly is South Africa and her neighbors doing to implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I've provided the answer in a single graphic that participants can read in their own time. I thank you.
Thanks, thanks, Mo. I think Ed is online. Ed, some of your insights.
Thank you. So maybe let me just spend 2 minutes talking about AIM's regional investment thesis for ports and logistics, and then a little bit around what we're doing to try to address efficiencies on respective corridors. So maybe just to start, we're principally focused on bulk and break bulk in the region, and on temperature-controlled logistics in the region. I think on the bulk and break bulk side, we think there's a tremendous opportunity, not just because we see significant capacity deficits on certain commodity sets like manganese and chrome, but also because we see continued fragmentation of ownership of bulk handling infrastructure across the region, and a significant need for integrated corridor efficiency across the value chain. That's on the bulk side. On the temperature-controlled logistics side, we think it's also a very quick and evolving marketplace. Africa is seeing some of the highest rates of urbanization of any region in the world, and will add more urban dwellers by 2050 than India and China combined. And on the back of that, we think the continent is going to need and see significant growth in demand for temperature-controlled logistics infrastructure at the key centers of demand and at the key ports across the region. So we're looking at both of those sectors, but let me maybe just touch on a few of the things that we focus on around trying to improve efficiency along the corridors. And I think a large part of it is around trying to invest in a way which restores rational logic across of logistics corridors in the region. Too often, as a non-port sector expert but an investor, I see strange patterns in Africa where cargo travels 4 times the distance it should to reach a port, and the reasons typically pertain to issues with border crossings, lack of hinterland infrastructure, or challenges with rail corridor quality in the region. So one of the things we tend to do is try to invest in a way which restores rational logic. We focused on, for instance, on the border crossing side, much as there's been quite a lot of investment in this space in the recent past, we think there's still considerable room for players to establish border crossing terminals, but not just to speed up the processing at the borders, but also to potentially support modal shifts on key corridors. An example of that from one of the companies we've just agreed to acquire is a company called TLG Mozambique, which is trying to establish a border crossing terminal at the Rossano Garcia border to support a modal shift before cargo travels into and out of the port of Maputo, and in doing so substantially reduces the turnaround time for trucks that have to otherwise not just clear both border crossings but also then engage with circa 6 hours of congestion into and out of the port. So we think these types of sort of specific or corridor-specific initiatives can add value and need to be addressed on a very specific way for each corridor's requisite needs. The second thing that we do is we try to come up with innovative ways to deal with backhaul. Backhaul is one of the biggest perennial issues, particularly on the smaller corridors across the region, where the outbound freight would frequently be something like bulk, the inbound freight might well be something like liquids. And as a consequence, we see inefficiency and empty legs in both directions, whether they be by rail or by road. And so one of the things our portfolio companies have been proactively trying to do is come up with innovative ways to allow for different types of cargo to be shifted in both directions in different formats. Either putting bulk into containers or, for instance, putting liquid fuels into bladders, but ultimately creating additional mechanisms to enable equal flow of cargo in both directions. I think the third key piece is definitely logistics tech. There's a number of logistics tech players that have raised very substantial amounts of seed capital in the region. We think this is going to be one of the fastest growing areas of the industry. We ourselves are also interested in this space. The TLG asset, which we've agreed to acquire, has a similar type of platform, which tries to match cargo owners with transporters, and not just allow cargo owners to secure the best spot rates for the cargo, but also to match inbound and outbound flows, and thereby minimize empty legs. And we think, these are important initiatives, not just for efficiency's sake, but also for because of carbon footprint purposes. Some of the greatest savings of carbon emissions in the region would entail both efficiency around those backhaul logistics plays and minimizing the amount of unnecessary trips, but also a modal shift to rail. And I think investing in a way which supports the transition to rail is something we're committed to doing across the region to try to reduce carbon footprints. Let me stop there. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Ed. Maybe let me just start off with you whilst we have you online. You mentioned AIM is wanting to focus around bulk and break bulk, but we see the world trend that there's a high degree of penetration bulk and break bulk cargo, which means that it's going into containers. Good example is copper, because of security issues. Manganese is being bagged. So do you think AIM has the ladder on the right wall?
I do think so. I mean, look, I think for a player like us, we recognize that the container terminal space is dominated by some very substantial major players. We, as a financial investor, have not ruled out looking at container terminals, and we do that where major operators look for partners. I think our motivation to pursue the bulk sector is principally because of some of the challenges you've mentioned. Ownership remains fragmented. If you look aside from large-scale mineral bulk, if you look at the agri-bulk landscape, it's still quite often in family hands, small fragmented terminals across the market, many of which are not extracting what I would call common user economics. And we think the market would support players of scale that can achieve those common user economics on an independent basis and not being affiliated with any particular trading or other interests.
Yeah.
So that's a lot part of what motivates us. But I think your point is well noted, that we are very cognizant that the modal shift, and this happens even on cold storage logistics towards containers, will continue. And so part of, I think, the challenge is to invest in opportunities which also support that modal shift over time.
Yeah. And moving over to Lufuno and Lovemore. Lufuno, you touched on the single window, and Lovemore, coming from a SADC background and being in that Secretariat's office, what would it take, Lufuno, to actually get the single window implemented, and because it ties directly with what Lovemore was talking about in terms of smart corridors, what are some of the sort of impediments that we foresee to implement that?
Look, starting with at a national level, I think it's what it requires is the will of all the relevant players. I mean, if you look at it in South Africa, you've got border management, you've got SARS, you've got the Port Authority. It's an issue of the will for those different role players to come together and ensure that we've got that platform that then becomes a single platform in terms of the interface. That's number one. The other thing is again, the issue of issue of security that now that from time to time in the engagement it gets raised in terms of what in the earlier panel have raised, that if I open it in terms of interoperability, how safe is your data on the other side? Would you not compromise my data on this other side? And open for me for in terms of the security attacks. But I think one of the things that we need to adopt is to move ahead, to move ahead and just go ahead, because technology is there. The issue that is there is the institutions and the willingness in terms of the institution. I don't think probably Lovemore could add to that. There's no, I don't think we've got a challenge with the technology.
Right.
Technology is already there. It exists in the market. It has been tested somewhere else. But the issue of the willingness. But I think I'm glad that Lovemore was sharing some of the stuff that is being done at a regional level. The issue of the pilot that he's talking about. But the first form, in particular in South Africa, is to have that single window, SARS, Port Authority, which is the National Port Authority, together with the border management.
Yeah, no, we don't have much time left, but I think this session alone needs a complete conference on its own and a message to DMG events, and I think it's technology is a big part of corridors, and that's what we need to be focusing on: infrastructure and digitalization. But let me hand you back over to Jeff.
Thanks, Mervyn, and to the panel. And I know there's been lots of time challenges, but thank you very much for getting through some really important topics now. I know Debbie's going to join us on the stage, so please, you can leave us. Thank you, Lovemore.
Well, thank you very much to Jeff for leading our conversation the entire day. It's quite a job. I think Jeff deserves a big round of applause. He's done a phenomenal job.
Thank you.
And yes, I'd like to just say thank you to everybody for sitting, especially in the last session. It's always a challenge, but there are so many amazing topics and so much was spoken about. So thank you to each of you for being here. Thank you to all our delegates and supporters. An apology from DMG Events. I know that we had some technical issues this morning, and I really do want to apologize for that, and thank all of our hybrid or our digital speakers who soldiered through despite some of those tech issues. I specifically wanted to extend apologies to one of our sponsors, Gautrain, poor Mr. William Dax. We lost him, and we really apologize for that omission and that technical glitch. Gautrain have been an amazing partner of ours, and we really, really appreciate their support. And yes, we can only just promise to get better. I just wanted to also add that I think there's been a lot of discussion the last 2 days, and for us, what we're leaving this conference with, I think, with the thought that there's a lot of work to be done. We had some really good input from you, the delegates, about let's get some key takeouts from this event, and let's measure our progress. So we're very pleased to announce that we're going to be doing that over the next few months. We're going to be working with some partners, and we are going to ask you, the industry, to benchmark some of your activities, launching what we call an industry confidence index. And that's going to include a number of temperature checks throughout the year based on some of the outputs from this event, and will be presented at next year's event. So that's something very exciting, and we're very, very pleased that we can actually produce something that tracks what we're doing. With that, I think, yes, I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. Thanks to our amazing sponsors, thanks to all our supporters, thanks to City of eThekwini. For those of you who are going to be joining us this evening at the Women in Transport Awards, we look forward to seeing you at the Elangeni at 6:30. Some amazing, inspiring women going to share their stories. For those of you who are going to be travelling home, travel safely, bon voyage. And we will see everybody between the 28th and the 29th of September 2022, same place. With that, Hambani Kahle. Thank you.
Please join me to thank Devi and the DMG team for putting all of the activities together and all the panels. There's a tremendous amount of work prior to the event and during the session, so thank you very much, Devi, to you and all your team.